welcome to the Understanding Projects podcast. My discussion today is with Jennifer Beckett. Jennifer is a project manager working in the public service sector. Her background in sociology and project management and her passion for public service has positioned her to work on projects in community housing, homelessness, COVID emergency response, immigration and settlement, and many other worthwhile endeavors. She has a special interest in the connections between community organizations and governing systems and their impact on the lived experience of citizens. Our discussion today is on the topic of power and influence. Jennifer talks about the importance of effective communication, leadership, and approaches for influencing project team members and other stakeholders in order to achieve project goals. Here is Jennifer Beckett.
So what do you think makes for an effective leader during projects?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think effective leadership for me is it's really kind of multifaceted, right? So I think, how do you connect with your team? How do you get to know them? Do people want to follow you? Do people want to like you? And kind of get on board, and kind of at the same time leaning into some of those, maybe harder characteristics of being able to like draw some boundaries around things like where the scope of your project is, being able to gauge what an appropriate yes is to your team and an appropriate no, at different times. So I think that it really depends on the makeup of your team, and being really mindful and having that emotional intelligence of, where are my strengths as a leader, right? So for me, being a 30-something female with, one kind of resume versus you who might have, in a different cohort, in a different demographic that has a different kind of resume, we're probably going to lead very differently and might be equally effective, right? Depending on how we come at it. I'm probably not going to use the same exact style you would, but that doesn't make one way necessarily better than the other.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. And I've often, the danger of looking at someone that you see as being a great leader and then trying to completely copy and emulate them. Like, you can certainly learn things, but if you try to be that person, it can come across like it works because they are them and you are you. So you have to find out what that is.
Yeah.
What is it about you that makes for a good leader?
Yeah, like I think some people have a certain kind of authority that they might just walk into a room and like command a room. Where, for me, I tend to, come into a room and I lean into like really co-creation and leveraging skill sets. And I just think, yeah, it depends on what you bring to the table, and not trying, when you try to bring something to the table as a leader that you're not and that you can't effectively emulate from maybe some, from to your point, one of your mentors or someone you look up to, it's really hard to sustain that through a project, especially longer ones, if it's not coming authentically to you.
Yeah. And that when you mentioned that, the person who comes into the room, and we've all experienced this, the person comes in and all of a sudden they almost command your attention, heads, people start listening and heads turn and so on, versus there's other people that don't have that, but they do it in different ways. And that almost speaks to the one of the key concepts of power and influence. And how do you see that? Like, what are the things that project managers, and managers in general, need to think about that? Because if we're talking about project managers, a lot of times you don't have what's called positional or legitimate power or authority. The people don't report to you. You're not the boss of them, so you can't use that. What do you do then in those situations?
Yeah, I think a couple of different things come to mind for me here. So one being having some perspective. So being able to remove yourself a little bit from where you might see yourself in hierarchy. So this is something in my role, in kind of my, my regular 9 to 5 project management role, that I employ quite often. And I have a close relationship, for example, with senior leadership. So I work closely with directors, the commissioner team, management level, senior leaders. And I work really closely with, more frontline staff. So staff that are doing the work, that have like that kind of hands-on expertise. And so being able to understand fully how to build relationships with folks at all different levels of the hierarchy of the organization you're working in, and then being able to understand how they meld together, where the friction is, and where the opportunity is to build teamwork and to align folks to work towards the same project goal, hopefully. So I think in building kind of a power or an influence with different levels of team when it comes to project management, understanding what people's goals are, uh, what motivates them, what inspires them, and at the end of the day, like who they're responsible and accountable to, will help you as a project manager, and helps me regularly as a project manager think about, okay, I'm dealing with a stakeholder right now who is in senior leadership level, and we're all trying to get to the same place, but they're trying to address a political fire that's happening somewhere. And so how can I address the political fire with them, say, yes, we recognize this is a challenge, and how do we solve this challenge or this conflict with the scope of our project to bring things back to where we think we're all going together, and kind of hold that in alignment, hold that tension. I think no matter what level of leadership or hierarchy someone is in an organization, everybody wants to feel like you're on their team, and everybody wants to feel like you have their back. And being able to listen and understand where they're coming from, as not just a person, yes, but also as their responsibility as a leader or a frontline staff person, and lean into that, and bring that back to the more narrow focused goal of the project. For me, I
Yeah.
think that helps to build that influence over time, and also helps people to trust you over time.
Yeah. What is it that and you're right, you're trying to build that influence, right? You're trying to, you're working with them for some end. You've got some problem that you need to have solved, or we need to get something done by a certain point, or there's something going on that we're trying to work together on something, and therefore want them to, do what either what the project goals are, or what you see as the best solution in this case, or together you collaborate on the best solution. What is it? And you I think you described a few of them, but just to go to sort of linger on that for a moment, why would they listen to you? Like not everybody listens to everyone, right? There are some
That's true.
people we listen to, and there's some people we disregard. What are the things, that the qualities that will get them to be on your side, or at least not dismiss what you say immediately? What do you think?
Yeah, there's a couple of things. I think from a soft skills kind of perspective, it's like, are you a good listener? Have you heard them? Are you making an effort to say, yes, Dave, I hear you. I hear your challenges. Can you tell me more about that so I can have a bigger picture and how that fits in? And, leaning on those soft skills of leadership that we talk about so often in project management. Active listening, empathy, emotional intelligence, those kinds of pieces. I think additionally to that, and in a more technical skill set sense, being able to back up your recommendations in your risk matrix, in your communications planning. How is this reflected in your scope? Why is the recommendation that you're making in alignment with the project goals and scope? What are the risks of doing an action? What are the risks of not taking an action? And being able to lay that out for people, especially if they outrank you in an organization, to say, look, at the end of the day, Dave, this is up to you, what decision you're going to make. What I'm recommending is action A, because if you don't do it, these are the risks you're going to possibly incur. If you do, these are the risks and the benefits as well. And so I think leaning on that documentation piece, and really having a fulsome understanding of why those things matter. It's not just a checklist exercise to say, yep, we've identified risks here, check mark, never think about it again. Those are tools you can use as a project manager to help push your team forward, not from a personal necessarily lens of, I want this to happen as a project manager, and so I'm going to recommend an action. It's like, well, no, my job is to move the project forward. This is what you've told me your goals are. And so this is how I'm going to be able to help get you there, not just because I'm a good listener, but also because I understand the full picture of action versus non-action in a certain, instance.
Yeah, so there's two, I think, important sides that you were describing there. The one was the active listening, the empathy, the, being the honesty with them, perhaps. And that one, to me, if we think about the different sources of power, that one would be, I think, generally grouped in the source of power called referent power, or might be referred. I'm not even sure if the pronunciation is referent or referent, but in any sense. And just a couple of things on that. I've always found that source of power kind of a hard one to describe. That you almost have to just give examples, like we've just done. Well, it's active listening, and it's this, and it's this, and it's this, and it's those things that I think when you first gave the first example, when you said, that person that just commands the room, they're heavy, they're high in referent power. Just a quick aside, funny story. I was just having a class this term and was trying to describe what referent power was, and Googled it. And funny enough, now this is completely unverified, but I just thought it was a funny anecdote. Somebody had whoever the writer was of this Google post had the idea that perhaps the original researchers misspelled it and should be reverent power. So that would be a funny joke. We'd have to talk to the people. It was that theory was done.
Would it be the first time that history, could use some revision?
So anyways, back to referent power, which is what it officially is called. How do you, if we kind of have this sense that it's this, person who is, has sort of commands the room, a bit of a, sort of a reputational thing. How do you, the key question is, how do you get that? Like what, for the person who's new, that's just starting with an organization, their referent power is probably pretty low. Not zero, but not high. How do you develop that? What's the strategy? Do you have strategies?
Yeah, I think for me, and this one comes, I think, from, leaders that I've seen come into an organization as well, and stuff that maybe I've tried, trial and error, what works for you, what works for me, is really coming in and listening. And I know I feel like I've, said that a couple of times already, but because it's so valuable, right? Like you want to come in and listen to people and not just, think that some stuff that has probably been tried before. One example that I think about often, and I don't work specifically in this area with the municipality, but when people talk about bike lanes, for example, right, and how do we increase active transportation in the region of Waterloo, or whatever the issue is, but for this particular one, and you get new leaders or voices in the community that come in and say, well, haven't you just tried putting in bike lanes? And of course, you've got people working in an organization that have been here for 20, 30, 40 years in some cases saying, yeah, you don't think we've thought of that? So you kind of come at it as, what does it mean to the people that you're leading or learning from to be able to lead, to kind of think about where they've been and their journey to get to where they are, especially if you're coming into organizations that have been around for a long time.
Right.
Because people have great ideas. People aren't stupid. People have been doing their job sometimes for decades. They thought of everything in the book. And so, listening to where teams have been, what their barriers have been like, where their successes have been. And then as a leader, I think being able to say, okay, are those barriers, do they still exist? Are we still facing the same barriers, whether it's financial, infrastructural, power related, could be 100 things, and really taking the time to learn the culture of an organization, the dynamics between teams, so that you're not essentially putting your foot in your mouth, a month into a new position or a new leadership role to say, oh, well, if I had to just ask some questions to begin with, then maybe we would have a better sense of why we are in this position rather than just we are in this position.
Right. That's a really good point. And I've experienced that of watching people come into an organization and they're in a meeting with a group of people. And they, instead of listening, they're just speaking and saying all kinds of things that are not in context, that the like you said, the organization may have thought of, or they may not be, may not really be something that's effective. And they're unfortunately not realizing that that is affecting the opinion of everybody around the table, of potentially very important stakeholders that are suddenly getting the impression of, oh, this person just likes to talk, and they're not, you're saying so much about yourself. So the best, really good advice is when you join an organization, uh, listen more than you speak. It doesn't mean you don't speak. Like, don't sit there and say nothing, but listen first. Get a lay of the land, figure out what's already known, ask questions. And that will allow you then to, when you do speak, people will say, oh, that was something that was well thought out.
Yeah, what a piece of advice I got years ago that I think about often is, especially when you're coming in, especially if you're trying to lead a new team, especially if, people don't know you very well, you're coming in brand new, you're just starting out in your project management kind of career, and you're trying to build trust, is, as much as possible, be the last person to speak around the table, right? Because then you're having a chance to hear everyone's response, gauge the dynamics of the team, because you're going to pick up on stuff, right? You're going to be able to hear, oh, Jackie and Chris don't get along very well, and you can pick up the tension maybe in the room, or we've been down this road, people are tired, people are frustrated with this one specific solution. Kind of understanding who is more quiet at the table and thoughtful, right? Just reading the room, learning your team, so that when you're responding, you're not shutting people down too, right? So if 2 people out of 5 at the table have spoken, and then all of a sudden you as the new leader jump in and start to, rally your ideas around, and they're so, your ideas are valuable too. But your job in that moment in the beginning is to figure out what is going on with everybody else, and encourage all voices hopefully to be heard at that table, with yours going last, so that you're responding to the team and not to one individual at a time. If I
Right.
agree with you out of the gate and make that known, then someone else with a different idea may think, oh, well, the new leader already agrees with Dave, so they might not voice a dissenting opinion, which might really be brilliant too. And so
Right.
I think you can miss some opportunity if you jump in too soon and too boldly.
Yes. Yeah. And just, and you really, when you're in those situations, is really think about what is really happening, to try to think of, instead of just your own point of view, think of the system of what's going on in the room.
Mhm.
That how are other people viewing you? Are they viewing you as, the person who just tries to jump in and talk over people, kind of the blowhard sort of thing? Or are you reflective? Are you contemplative? Are you fair? Are you collaborative? And all those things are building up your bank account of referent power. And that's, if you think about it that way, of you're building your reputation and so on, and how you're being viewed. That's, I think that's really good. The second part of kind of what you said was, have your, I sort of interpreted as you were saying to, make sure that you've done your homework a little bit, that you've got your plans in place, that you've, checked your risk register or whatever, if that's what you're talking about. And I kind of view that as to, kind of know what you're talking about, do your homework. That's more of the expertise power side of things. And I kind of view that as two sides of the same coin. That's, if you're a really empathetic listener, but don't, didn't do your homework, don't have the background, that's nice, but you need that other part too, which is you need competency. And so that's a key one as well.
Yeah, I think sometimes in leadership discussions and power and influence and, those kinds of discussions, we tend to forget a little bit about those technical skills. It's so important to have the great soft skills and leadership skills and all those personality traits that you want to nurture and foster as a leader, but you still need to know what you're talking about.
Right.
To your point. And I think that, especially if you're coming into teams, and something that I experience often is folks that have been in their role for many, many years, or have been in the organization for many, many years. So if I come into a meeting and start talking about stuff that, I actually have no clue if I had just read an extra 4 or 5 documents, would have helped bolster that conversation. It does the team a disservice, and it does a disservice to myself and to the project overall, right? Because it's really hard to rebuild, like it creates a gap between you and your team. And if that gap right out of the gate is your team walking away from that introduction, that kickoff meeting, or a couple of managers that you need, a couple of champions you need on your side saying, this girl doesn't know anything about our business, doesn't know anything about the industry or the sector. It's really hard to regain that, trust, and that reputational kind of impact. It can be really difficult to, you're starting in from a negative, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's really hard to rebuild. And I think to that point too, there's going to be times where maybe you don't have time to do a full 6 weeks of research into whatever it is you're being thrown into. So then just say that. I think it does, to be to a point you made earlier about being honest, transparent, saying, okay, guys, I just got this assignment literally
Yep.
yesterday. I'm still getting caught up to speed. Asking them for their input and expertise, and just saying, I haven't gone through the risk matrix yet, or the risk register. I'm not sure. What do you think about, these ideas? And being really transparent about where you are, is going to give yourself a little bit of leeway and a little bit of grace, so that when you misspeak, when you don't know something, you can say, right, true, I'm still getting caught up, and your team knows that.
Yeah.
Versus coming in and saying, I know all the things about this project, I am here to solve your problems.
Yeah.
And then really, you don't have the first clue. Is both a technical fault and a soft skill fault, I would argue.
Yeah, no, that's so important not to fake it. If you go in and make things up because you don't want to admit that, like you said, that transparency of saying, hey, I didn't get a chance to read the report. Let's talk about it, like fill me in. Or that people will respond well to honest, admissions, as opposed to they will very much become suspicious if they think someone's trying to, uh, pull a fast one on them and fake knowledge. So that is so, I really agree. That's so important. Oh yeah, what I was going to say was, and there's many times when you can't possibly have more expertise than your team members. For example, if you're managing a team of engineers, or a team that has engineers on it, and you're not an engineer, you can't possibly know the technical knowledge that they do know, but you need to know there's a certain amount you do need to know, and you got to figure that out. You got to be able to talk to them and not go, oh my goodness, you're an engineer, I can't possibly talk to you. Of course you can. So you got to figure out, where's that line that you need to know this, they'll fill in the rest, and yeah, that happens all the time.
Yeah, and I think too, sometimes that comes down to, pulling people outside of a group meeting, right? So I worked on a project last year. We were building a portal for an application system for a social service program. And, it'd been under construction for a long time with the developer. And I'm not a software engineer. I don't know the first thing about, coding. I have never coded anything in my life. But to sit in a meeting and criticize the developer as the project manager, for me to sit there and say, why isn't this done, and going through the list of incomplete deliverables, is some of that valid in the sense of, why is this taking so long? Yes, that's my job, right, as the project manager, to say, where's the accountability, what are the timelines, what does this look like? And also then to maybe call John, my developer, on the side and say, what am I missing here? This is taking a long time. Is there stuff happening on the back end that I wouldn't know without having that expertise? And that builds your relationship with your stakeholder, right? So it gives you a little bit of a different kind of back end channel of communication, which is important when things get sticky and you're in the thick of things, and there's money on the line, or deliverables on the line, or you've made promises to the public, for example. And it also helps you as a project manager learn a little bit of that content versus just context of project, right? So you can learn what it means. Like, it might take a software engineer 5 times longer than I think it would to code out a new interface for a portal, right? For an application. I have no idea how long that takes, My job is to learn about it so that then when you say, okay, this should take me 5 weeks, and then it takes you 10 weeks, I can say, okay, John, what happened? You told me 5 weeks. That's why I had that conversation, and be able to hold some accountability and that tension in the project, but without, yeah, to your point, without learning a little bit about the content of what you're, managing, it's really hard to do that with any kind of authority.
Yeah. And what I found too is if you built that relationship with the highly technical resources on your team, and if there's a certain amount of confidence you need to be able to do this, which is to say, okay, Joe, could you put that in layperson's terms? What is the,
Yeah.
if you can get them to translate and then you train, then you can find that common terminology, but a lot of times people new to this will just be sort of afraid of the terminology and not try to find a middle ground between different areas.
Yeah, which I think it can cause such a disservice and like unnecessary stress in a project, right? I think if you're transparent from the beginning as a project manager, like you're not going to always, and probably most times, depending on the structure that you're working within, be the expert on the team of what you're building or, managing. Your job isn't to be the end all, be all, know all of the things, whether it's software or engineering or, a policy or a program. Your job is to leverage the strength of the team members that you've rallied and that have been assigned to the project.
Right.
So, lean on those folks, going into a project, trusting that your team is competent, smart, has the expertise that you need to move things forward, balancing with reading the room and understanding where there might be,
Right.
some deficiencies maybe in your team. Understanding where you sit as a project manager and not
Yeah.
trying to be everything and be everything to everybody.
Yeah. And that's what, really, really good leaders will figure that out as to do that. Now, a question I have, and it's just sort of a, there's often a really overlap or intersection between communication and leadership. That and almost a question I have, and I was just thinking about this before we started talking, are great leaders really good communicators, or are good communicators really great leaders? Like, is it which way's the
Which
arrow,
came first?
or is it, what do you think in terms of leadership and communication?
I think it's a good question. It's a bit of a brain teaser, I think, because when I think about my own development as a leader of projects and within certain kinds of contexts, you have to be a good communicator to be successful at leading, I think, right?
Yeah.
Do you have to be a leader to be a good communicator? I don't know. I think lots of people can be communicators and be really valuable as a team member. So I think, like, to answer your question from my perspective, every good leader is a good communicator, but not every good communicator must be a leader.
Right. Agreed. So how do you, if being a good communicator will enables you to lead, you don't have to, like, it does. Yeah, we have everyone should be able to communicate, but if great leaders use they need communication, how do you develop, like, how do you do that? Are you born with it, or is there ways to develop it?
I think both. I think that's where referent power really comes into play, right? Is how do you nurture relationships? Are you honest with people? Are you kind to people? Can you use appropriate, jargon when you need to, especially in really like really tight teams that are working in like one niche area. I think that it does take practice. It is a skill set to have that kind of communication ability. And also, I think has to come a little bit authentically at times too, right? Like, the more comfortable you are with yourself as a person, I think will lend itself to your leadership style, your communication style. It's a tough question, I think, to answer,
Yeah.
honestly. I'm kind of
No,
like working it out as we're talking.
exactly. No, you're
Yeah.
doing there. It is a question that doesn't have a succinct answer.
Mhm.
There's lots of strategies, and I know myself, it's practice makes, not perfect, but makes better.
Right.
I do know when I first started, I'm just thinking of teaching. Prior to that, I was in, industry and project management and so on. So I had lots of chances to communicate. But teaching is a specific form of communication. I remember in the early days, it was kind of nerve-wracking. It's like you'd almost get a little nervous. And probably if I could go back and watch some of my early lectures, they probably weren't that good. And
You're probably
but
great, Dave.
well, they weren't as good. But
Sure.
but they have certainly improved over time just by doing it. Like, it just
Right.
becoming comfortable and figuring out, hey, I'm not, sometimes and again, it's being authentic. We often think of that, professor that was in Dead Poet Society, the Robin Williams, we're not that. We're not Robin Williams, like,
Right.
who are we then? And that's the key thing, is to figure out who that is and then leverage that talent.
Yeah. I think too, yeah, to your point, leveraging it, lean into it, be honest with yourself and show up, kind of bring yourself to your leadership role. Like one thing I talk about with my director quite often is I'm not really interested, for me, in managing the day-to-day ongoings of a team. I don't care about improving vacation time. I don't care about, if you need a sick day, like, yeah, sure, great. I'm interested in doing the project management.
Mhm.
And so that referent power, that ability to kind of influence without authority, like those pieces are what interest me. And so, what serves me well as a leader personally is to just acknowledge that, call a spade, not try to take on things in my portfolio that I'm going to drop the ball on knowingly going into it. Right. And that allows me space to really nurture those things that I'm kind of already good at, that I have interest in, and that serve my projects well. There's lots of people that are really interested in doing the supervisory pieces in other people's work, and are interested in doing that and want to. So I am happy to let them do that. It allows them to lead in a way that works for them that wouldn't work for me. Right. And so in an organization and a project team, you need all kinds of different leadership. For me, I don't see a ton of value necessarily in stepping into a place where I'm just not interested. And maybe later in my career where it makes sense to take a different step, sure. But if you're one of those people who, like me, just want to, we have a goal, we're a team, we're working towards it. I don't need to be your boss in order to make it happen. Perfect. Awesome. There's lots of space for people like that in project management and leadership, just like there's lots of space for people that want to, have a team of 9 that, report into them. And that's great. And that's awesome.
Right.
And there's lots of need for that too.
Yeah. No, I agree. It's find out your interest. And I've had points then in my career when I've gone, there was major parts of my job that I just didn't like,
Mm-hmm.
and dreaded it. And that's a signal to maybe either, learn why you don't like it and develop that, or move into an area you do like. Just the one thing you mentioned about, working with your director, that we talked a little bit before we started, and the term managing up was used, which is
Mm-hmm.
really kind of related to this, that we're talking about, is influencing. Managing up is really means, influencing, those higher than you in the organization, and it's almost from a personal. Managing up also, often has a, personal career development sort of feel to it. So I'm just, I guess my question is how do you do this without the negative side? Is sometimes it can be viewed by others as, oh, you're just trying to be the, the boss's pet, or the teacher's pet, and look, they're just, and sometimes it can harm your relationships at your level. How do you navigate that? Have you run into that? For that, because I agree, managing up is really important, but how do you do it?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it looks a little bit different for everyone, again, kind of based on your social location. Again, for me, I'm a 30 something female with a certain resume in a certain kind of organization. For me, it's a couple really key things. One is keeping it very professional. So, not ever leaning too heavily into the personal side of why I'm making a recommendation. I might really believe strongly in what I'm recommending, and hopefully I do. Hopefully I'm always taking on projects that I believe in, especially working in social services, community impact, that kind of work. But keeping that the personality out of it to an extent, and keeping things professional with those relationships with those that are outranking you, your bosses, their bosses sometimes, and that kind of interpersonal work. In addition to that, I think, again, to go back to some of the documentation pieces, having everything that you're doing, every recommendation you're making being well documented, well supported by the legwork that you're doing, managing upwards and having that kind of impact and being essentially an advisor to those that are outranking you in an organization means you have to put the legwork in. You got to do the work to make sure that your recommendation is well founded, that it has legs, so that if they decide to fact check you and go around you and ask your staff, is this true? Where is this data coming from? That it's well supported. You've got to know your stuff. It's something that, when you're well supported, you've been, professional in your recommendations, you really know the impact and can see it from a bigger picture. It's hard to argue with that kind of fact and logic, right? And a lot of people, as they climb the ladder in organizations, do so because they can look at fact and logic, hopefully.
Right.
That's the hope, I think, that we all have in our leadership. So I think, again, it goes back to what we've kind of themed throughout, maybe incidentally, that those soft skills are really important, but the technical ability and the strength behind it is what's going to give you that real influence at the end of the day without looking like you're being, a teacher's pet or a leader's pet.
Yeah, like it's a really interesting challenge, and it's one that people should really think about, because organizations, if you're just going to be that, boss's pet, teacher's pet, you're just the yes person. Then you're just, that was the greatest idea I've ever heard. Of course, you're just being the yes person. And organizations, if you really look at it further, that's not really ultimately what they want. They want someone who's going to have ideas, that critically thinks, that provides recommendations, but does it respectfully and isn't giving the impression to their boss that, of course, why wouldn't you do this, dummy? Like it's done in a very tactful, just respectful way, that, again, using those interpersonal, referent power skills and abilities that you have, you can then influence your boss, higher levels. And it's a win-win, because things are going to be done maybe more effectively. They also get a positive view of you when promotion time comes around, or end of year raises and things like that. It's all kind of works well together. But it's an important thing is to view as managing up is not a bad thing. It's actually a good thing.
It is a good thing.
Work on. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think too, being able to recognize, to that critical thinking point of, if my boss says to me, hey, can you vet this idea for me? Or can you look at this and kind of think about how it might impact, the goals of what we're trying to achieve here? And being able to say, hey, you know what? I see the value in this idea, but I think this doesn't fit into this, and this is why. Being able to say, no, I actually don't think that's a great idea,
right,
in a way that is tactful and respectful, and saying, not a great idea necessarily in this way. How can we pivot? How can we shift it together? And understanding, to what we talked about kind of earlier on in our conversation around what's motivating that leader. What is it that they're being held accountable for in their individual role outside of maybe the project team, and being able to pull in some of those pieces to a pivot, right? If you have to. Sometimes you can say, yes, that's a fabulous idea, because it is one.
Right.
Other times you have to say, respectfully, that's the worst idea I've ever heard, in a way that, and hopefully you build a relationship with your leadership so you can say that honestly, respectfully, professionally, all those things. But to say, if we go down that road, it could blow up in our faces.
Right.
But at the end of the day, recognizing that you're not the decision maker in a lot of cases too, right?
It's a real tricky one, because, while you don't want to be that yes person, you don't want to also be the always no person.
Absolutely.
The negative, there's, negative Dave, everything's wrong in the world. You also don't want to be that person. But there's also a point in every organization where the decision has been made and your job now is to support it. Like
That's right.
that's something to really understand. When is the decision still open and when is it closed? And when it's closed, for you to continue to rail against it, again, will start to decrease your power base, right? Is because you'll be viewed as, oh, okay, doesn't like change, is resistant,
Yes.
etc., obstinate. Those are words you don't want associated with yourself.
Yeah, and I think too, being able to recognize why that makes it so important that when someone does come to you and say, hey, in my case, hey, Jenny, we're vetting this idea. How does this impact the project? To say at that point, I don't think this is a good idea, or I do think this is a good idea, so that when the decision is closed, you can feel personally and professionally that you've said your piece, that you believe in what you've said, and that you can carry out, the next steps the way that they have to get done, whether you're really on board or not, whether you really believe in the decision or agree with it, but that you aren't feeling like kicking yourself later for saying, oh, I wish I would have said this, or, oh, I wish I would have done a better job vetting the idea, because if I had, I would have seen this risk ahead of time. So really doing your due diligence when you're asked to vet something or asked to explore an option, so that when the decision is closed, everyone is on the same page. It's as transparent as possible. When you're not going back to be like, oh, I wish I would have really said something earlier, because you could have.
Right. So Jenny, this has been an excellent discussion. I've had, we've covered a lot of areas of power and influence and communication, and so on. It's such an important topic. Like, again, I always go back to students, and talk about, this is often why things fail. It's not because maybe the incorrect project, scheduling software was selected. It comes back to communication and leadership and interpersonal and so on. It's the way teams work together. So this has been a really, really good discussion on some really good tips for how to people to navigate, themselves in that area and in their career.
Yeah, thanks so much. And I could talk about this all day.
Me
So
too.
it's something that I think is so important. And yeah, that marriage really of emotional intelligence, soft skills, and like the technical really back up to give you your gun power at the end of the day, your firing power. It's so interesting to me, and so important for successful leadership and project management. But thanks for having me, and I really appreciate it. And yeah, lots to reflect on for the remainder of the day.
Yeah, good. Okay, well, thanks again.
That's it for this episode. If you would like to learn more about project management, you can find my book, Understanding Project Management, A Practical Guide, on Amazon. Please also consider following Understanding Projects on your favorite podcast player or clicking subscribe on YouTube.